How often have we heard about G20 or come across news related to G20 countries? We read it, just assume it has something to do with some sort of economic or a trade treaty between countries and move on. So, in this episode of The Outdoor Woman, I am going to tell in detail about G20 and some recent developments regarding the same. So, what is G20? G20 is the short form of the Group of 20. It is a collection of 20 of the world's largest economies formed in 1999. It was formed with the motive that it would bring together the most important industrialized and developing economies to discuss international economic and financial stability. G20 was formed in the wake of the Asian financial crisis to unite finance ministers and central bankers from world's largest established and emerging economies. It was when the US realized that the more exclusive G7 was no longer capable of managing a global crisis on its own. Consequently, it invited finance ministers and central bank governors of a group of 20 countries as well as the leaders of key international economic organizations such as the IMF and World Bank to join them in developing a response to the crisis. In 1999, the meeting started as an informal get-together of finance ministers and central bankers seeking a dialogue between developing and developed nations. The positive effects of these dialogues drove the official development of the G20. A decade later, at the height of the global economic crisis, the G20 was elevated to include political leaders. Its annual summit has evolved into a major forum for discussing economies as well as other pressing global issues. One of the group's most impressive achievements was its vigorous response to the 2008 financial crisis. Every year, the leaders of G20 members meet to discuss mainly economic and financial matters and coordinate policy on some other matters of mutual interest. Each summit has primary objectives based on current events of the time, and they also provide opportunities for leaders from individual nations to meet over issues specific to their respective governments. Though economic and financial coordination remains the centerpiece of each summit's agenda, issues such as the future of work, terrorism, and global health are also recurring focuses. This was increasingly true in the decade following the global financial crisis, when the G20 was able to turn its attention beyond acute economic crisis management. The G20 is a forum and not a legislative body, so its agreements and decisions have no legal impact, but they do influence countries' policies and global cooperation. The G20 is best understood as a year-long process consisting of two tracks leading to a leaders' summit. The finance ministers and central bank governors track deals with issues like fiscal and monetary policy, financial regulation, investment in infrastructure, and tax issues. Then there is the Sherpa track, in which each state is represented by a senior official known as the Sherpa, who guides the leader to the summit. This track deals with the more political issues like global health, gender equality, and climate change. Now comes the membership and leadership part of the G20. G20 members include the G7 nations, which are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and 11 emerging markets and smaller industrialized countries, which are Argentina, Australia, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, and Turkey. The G7 nations have no legal or political authority, but they have significant influence as some of the leading economies in the world. Russia had formally joined in 1998 to create the G8, but it was excluded after invading Ukrainian territory of Crimea in 2013. The G20 is not a permanent institution with a headquarters, office, or staff. Its leadership rotates on an annual basis among its members. Its decisions are made by a general agreement, and implementation of its agenda depends on the political will of the individual states. The G20 also invites guest countries to attend their events. Spain is invited permanently, and so is the current chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the chair of the African Union, a representative of the New Partnership for Africa's Development, and at least one country invited by the presidency, usually from its own region. International organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the Financial Stability Board, and the World Trade Organization also attend the summits. The chairmanship of the G20 Leaders Summit rotates among 4 groups of countries. As each group's turn comes up, its members negotiate among themselves to decide who chairs the meeting. Saudi Arabia is hosting the G20 meetings this year. The G20's membership policies have been largely criticized. Critics say that the group is overly restrictive and its practice of adding guests, such as those from African countries, is little more than a token effort to make the G20 reflective of the world's economic diversity. Now let's see what is the importance of G20. The nations of the G20 account for around 80% of global economic output, nearly 75% of all global trade, and about 2/3 of the world's population. These figures have remained relatively stable. In 2008 and 2009, G20 nations agreed to spend measures worth $4 trillion to revive their economies, rejected trade barriers, and implement far-fetching reforms of the financial system. The G20's primary mandate is to prevent future international financial crises and shape the global economic agenda. The finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20 countries meet almost at the same time as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The growth of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that is the BRIC countries, has actually driven the growth of the global economy, and the G7 countries grow slower. Therefore, the BRIC countries are critical for ensuring continued global economic prosperity. Those nations have become more critical in providing the needs of the G7 nations. For example, Russia delivers most of the natural gas to Europe, China produces most of the manufacturing for the United States, India provides high-tech services. Now let's see the latest development about the G20. Financial officials of the G20 major economies have said that they agreed on a coordinated approach for a suspension of debt payments for the world's poorest countries starting on May 1st until the end of the year. This decision to suspend both principal repayments and interest payments affects all the International Development Association countries that are currently on debt to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and all least developed countries as defined by the United Nations that are currently on any debt to the IMF and the World Bank. This move is a part of efforts to provide stimulus in the economy of poor countries during the coronavirus outbreak. The actions to freeze both principal repayments and interest payments will free up more than $20 billion for the countries to spend on improving their health systems and fighting the coronavirus pandemic. The IMF has said that this year the global economy will experience its worst recession since the Great Depression and predicted that world economic output will shrink by 3% this year and experience a partial rebound next year. The forecast by IMF assumed that outbreaks of the novel coronavirus will peak in most countries during the second quarter and fade in the second half of the year. If the pandemic lasts through the third quarter, it could cause a further 3% contraction in 2020 and a slower recovery in 2021 due to the effects of bankruptcies and prolonged unemployment. A second outbreak in 2021 could cause a reduction of 5 to 8 percentage points in the global GDP baseline forecast for next year, keeping the world in recession for a second straight year. Emerging and developing economies face more dangerous challenges from the coronavirus pandemic, ranging from underfunded healthcare systems and debt burdens to high rates of unemployment. So, this relaxation by G20 major economies is definitely of some sort of relief to the poor countries. Some might wonder how a G20 decision will be implemented by the IMF or World Bank. The answer is that most member of G20 forum will have a strong say in the board of IMF and World Bank. So, a decision taken during a G20 meeting will definitely have effect in the world economy, and hence G20 has an important role to play in the global development. That's all from me today. Hope this episode was informative. Stay connected with us and thank you for the support.